Sorry, technical issues. Sorry, one problem. Good evening and welcome to our book passage event. So sorry, I am Allison Bainbridge. I am your host. We are so excited to have these two fabulous authors here to discuss the long-awaited follow-up to the acclaimed New York Times bestseller, The Golem and the Jinni, The Hidden Palace. In this enthralling historical epic set in New York City in the Middle East in the years leading to World War I, Helene Wecker revisits her beloved characters, Chava and Ahmad, as they confront unexpected new challenges in a rapidly changing human world. One critic said that Wecker deftly layers the story over those of the people they encounter, a spellbinding blend of fantasy and historical fiction, which I think is such a popular genre right now. We're finding at Book Passage that many people are coming in interested in those two genres as they're such great escapism for the times. Apparently, Helen has been asked multiple times what took so long for her to come out with a sequel. It's been 8 years in an industry where many authors publish a book a year. Well, I say it's well worth the wait, and our patience is richly rewarded. Helene received a BA from Carleton College in Minnesota and an MFA from Columbia University in New York, and her writing has appeared in many literary journals. Her first novel won multiple awards. She's a Chicago area native, but who has made her home in Minneapolis, Seattle, and New York. However, she now lives locally here near San Francisco with her husband and daughter. Ellen Kushner is joining us to moderate this fabulous discussion. She is award-winning author of the cult classic Swords Point, a melodrama of manners and other unclassified novels that move in the interstices of popular genres, known for many years as the host and writer of public radio's similarly unclassified series Sound and Spirit, which Bill Moyers called the best thing on public, and caused listeners to say, she's Elvis to hippie librarians. I love that. Ellen went on to record her novels as audiobooks for Neil Gaiman Presents, Audible, winning an Audie Award for Swords Point, and to create children's theater based on Jewish mythic event themes, for young audiences. She lives in New York City with her wife, author and educator Delia Sherman, and a great many theater and airplane ticket stubs she just can't bear to throw out. So please sit back and enjoy our wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much. Hello, Helene.
Hello. How are you?
I'm good now. I just want to say, because I know this is the first of your long book tour online, that one of us is going to say something incredibly stupid at some point that we regret bitterly. I'm sorry, not one of us, both of us. Each of us gets one incredibly stupid thing that we really regret saying, and I forgive us in advance.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Okay. So I must have read Golem and the Jinni kind of late because I don't remember no 8 years passing, but congratulations on the new book, which I have heavily thumbed here, and I really loved it. And I really wanted to kind of have a chance to talk writer to writer with you. So my first kind of global question to you is, I felt the mastery in this book. I felt like the first book was wonderful, but this is the book of somebody who really knows what she's doing as a writer and has a certain amount of confidence and even, dare I say, bravado and bravura. Did you feel that way, or is that just the way it came out?
Oh, it's like there are the days, right, where it's like, I have it. But it comes only after putting so much in the bank and just toiling and sweating and trying a scene 17 different ways, and none of them are working, and you're ready to tear your hair out. And then you go to bed and wake up the next morning and you're like, oh, wait a minute. It's not working because I'm telling it from the wrong point of view, or this is a flashback and it needs to be, in media res or whatever it is. And so I think if there is any of that there, and thank you very much for that description, it came there because of a lot of hours put into, getting this thing done and out into the world. And that is why it took so long, was I felt like I'd sort of set a bar for myself with the first one. That it was, and I wanted to do justice to the first book, to the characters in the book, and to what I felt like this book could be. And that's why I just didn't want to send it out before it was ready.
So your first, the terror of this, it's almost awful when your first book does really well, because then you're like, oh my God, I have to do as well or better. And that's actually really scary.
It is.
As a writer. Your first novel was almost, I got the sense, a collaboration between you and your agent.
Mm-hmm.
How realistic is that?
I don't know. Collaboration may be a little too strong, but definitely more of a group effort that he. So the story is that my wonderful agent, Sam Stoloff, he met me when I was in grad school. And we were I was at Columbia University, and one of the things that happens at Columbia, I think they still do it when you are a grad student, is there is what's called the mixer every year, where they all the professors bribe their agent friends and promise them all sorts of lavish things and drinks and whatever, and you get all of the agents into the room along with all of the students, and it's almost sort of like the dance at the middle school gym, where everyone's, the agents are on one side, the students are on the other, everyone's terrified, and then finally the students like walk over and introduce themselves to the agents and start like collecting business cards and pitching and all of that. I had 3 chapters of The Golem and the Jinni. And I figured I was just practicing pitching and, collecting cards. And when the book was done, I'd email people or whatever. I had been told, do not send unfinished work to an agent ever. So I was going around pitching people and collecting cards. And I got to Sam and I said, can you, I pitched him on it. And he said, oh, that sounds really good. Can you send it to me? And I was like, I've been caught out. And I said, I only have, however much I had. And he said, send it to me anyway. And so I did. And he wrote back and he gave me a whole bunch of comments. And he said, this looks really interesting. Keep going. And it was like this email game over, it was like 2 or 3 times a year. He would email me and say, so what have you written? And I would email him back and he would give me a bunch of comments and then went on. And then at a certain point, I think the book was about halfway done. He said, so how do you really want to go forward with this? Because at this point I've got enough to pitch it. And I went, oh,
whoa,
okay. And so we did, and HarperCollins bought it. And at that point, it was like a 3-way collaboration where it was me and Sam and my editor, Terry Carton, who was phenomenal. And we, I was the one driving it, but it was like workshopping. It really was sort of like workshopping. And it went on from there. And this is a very long answer to that question, but that is sort of how it happened. And this time it was much more free reign. I was left alone to do what I was going to do, which was, it showed a lot of trust on their part, but was also a little terrifying again.
Yeah, and I didn't mean collaboration as in they wrote it with you, but just that you got a lot of guidance and, well, why don't you make it this book? Well, why don't you make it more about this? But clearly they knew you and they knew what path to set you on. Well, do you want to read us a little bit from the new book?
This is from the beginning. This is from the first few chapters of the book, and it's sort of the where we are is that Chava the Golem and Ahmad the Jinni have reconnected. They are, the danger from the first book has passed. Now they can sort of get to know each other without a, giant menace looming over them. And they tend to go to Central Park a lot because if you've read the first book, you know that place has been a basis for their relationship and for a number of important scenes from the first book. So I'll read it's about 6 minutes or so. At last, the first true freeze of winter arrived, and Central Park gave itself to the cold and snow. The vining roses were pruned back to a handful of canes. The elms on the mall grasped the sky with empty fingers. I'm sorry, the Golem said one night as they neared the Harlem Mere. This will be a long walk back, and it's starting to snow again. Stop worrying about me, said the genie, and stop apologizing. I can't help it. I feel like I'm putting you at risk. You aren't asking me to jump in a river, Chava. I can manage a little snow. She sighed. It's just louder now, or it feels louder. Oh, it's hard to explain. She hugged herself as she walked, clearly miserable. With the onset of winter, her clay body had grown stiff and uncomfortable, an expected effect and manageable as long as she walked often enough. But now, like arthritic joints that ached with the rain, the scream in her mind, her trapped creator in his endless anger, had grown sharper, more distracting. She'd begun to make careless mistakes at the bakery, such as forgetting the raisins in the challah dough, or doubling the baking powder in the cookies so that they swelled as large as biscuits. Thea Radzin thought it a lingering effect of her widowhood. With each mishap, she cast a pitying look at her favorite employee, thinking, and who could blame the girl if she came unhinged? Do you think I'm coming unhinged? The golem asked suddenly. Do I think what? That I'm coming unhinged. It's what Thea thinks, though of course she doesn't say it. And no, she doesn't understand, but you do. So you must tell me, please. He blew out an impatient and unnecessary breath. Chava, you aren't coming unhinged, whatever that means. The winters are difficult for you. You know this. It's all of a piece, and you're handling it far better than I would, were I to hear that man screaming in my head all the time. You make it sound like he's hurling curses at me, she muttered. It's simpler than that, like a tinnitus, I suppose, just louder lately. Better hear, though? She gazed about at the dark tableau of the park, felt with her distant senses the earth below them, its warmth banked and waiting. The seasons would turn, she reminded herself. Her body would lose its stiffness and unease, and her mind would quiet once more. Yes, she said, better here. Spring arrived as promised. The rains began, forcing them apart and indoors, she sewing in her room each night, he working in the shop. Without him, she grew restless. Her mind strayed toward the couples who hurried by outside, laughing beneath their umbrellas, their thoughts full of what might happen when they reached their warm apartments, their inviting beds. He, too, became tense and distractible, full of unsettled longings, uncertain of their welcome. He, who'd once sauntered up Fifth Avenue so confidently in search of Sophia Winston's mansion. And she, meanwhile, reviewed every conversation they'd ever had upon the subject of faithfulness, his opinions ringing in her mind like a punishment. Humans and their ridiculous rules. But she also recalled something that had happened before the rains had separated them, a night when they passed a Lower East Side synagogue just as two women, clear at a glance as mother and daughter, emerged from its basement stairwell. The daughter's hair had hung down her back in damp coils. She'd shivered in the night air, nervous and excited, her pale face glowing. The older woman had put a comforting arm around her, and they'd hurried down the street together, mother whispering to daughter, the daughter nodding. It's late for a bath, isn't it? The genie had said as they disappeared. It's a mikveh, a ritual bath, she told him. And then, at his confusion, by Jewish law, a woman mustn't lie with her husband during her menses. Once it's ended, she immerses herself in the mikveh and recites a blessing. Brides do it too before the wedding ceremony. Ah, and the younger one? She marries in the morning. She'd waited for him to call it absurd or superstitious or any of his other usual complaints, but he'd only nodded as though half listening, his expression entirely opaque. Perhaps, she thought at her window, watching the rain. Perhaps. I think I'll end it there.
Okay, and I'll unmute and unstart video. Yes, I have my COVID hair still uncut, but kind of like it. So I just wanted to let everybody who's with us, you're very welcome. I'm very glad you're here. And if you have questions for the author, you can put them in the YouTube chat and they will be relayed to us before the end of this hour together. And I will feed your much cleverer and more interesting questions to Helene. Meanwhile, though, I have a few of my own. So I gotta tell you, yes. This will be fun. That when I received this book in the mail from your publisher, I felt very special, but I flipped it open, just flipped it open. And oddly enough, it opened on page 47, chapter 4, and I read a couple of sentences and went, oh my God, that's the way to do it. So let me read them to you right now. What you're doing. So section 1 of the book takes place from 1900 to 1908. You know this, I'm telling you that. Section 1 takes place from 1900 to 1908, but there are not 8 years worth of stuff in here, but she has to move us through the beginning of the 20th century. And here's how she does it. as the seasons changed, New York changed too, the city reveling in its constant newness, its own unending cycle of reinvention. I love that. And it's still true today, everybody. I live really close to where she went to grad school. So we're neighborhoodniks. We probably, bumped each other in the grocery store once or twice.
I jogged past where you live all the time.
Automobiles began to dot the streets. At first, they were only playthings for the wealthy, and everyone stopped to look when one went by. And then, seemingly from one day to the next, they were everywhere, tearing through intersections, rocketing around corners, blaring their horns at wagons and pedestrians, and there's a little conversation about it, and then telephones appeared. Fascinating for the Jinni, who couldn't believe such a thing was possible without sorcery. And it goes on. It's like you cover so much of what's happening in the outside world in just those couple of things. And I have to say that almost everything that happens in this book the important stuff happens inside in a weird sort of way. Mm-hmm. So Mazel Tov. And how did you do that?
It's funny.
That voice.
How did I get that voice? I think partly it was what I was talking about before, where it's like just coming at it from so many different directions, and then one day something clicks. Because you're right, I did, this book covers 15 years from beginning to end. The first book covered only 1 year. The first book was 1899 to like 1900, somewhere in the summer there. The second book, I wanted it to have a much longer scope. But then I realized I could make it 15 times longer. So I had to sort of devise ways to get to elide and compress and figure out how to get that time passed and when I could do it, because there were certain periods in the book where I figured, okay, not that much important happens in their lives. It's just their lives going on like normal, like people. So let's pick those years. And so I decided on like 1901 to 1905-ish would be the years that I sort of skipped over. And then it was, okay, well, what's happening then? And what are the outward signs? What are the, in old silent movies when they wanted to show time passing, and there would be the calendar on the wall and the breeze that comes and sort of whips the pages off. And, what sort of device could I use that was like that? And it ended up being that very visual device of what does the city look like? What is changing? That's the thing about New York, is it is always changing. And, I watched a bunch of old, silent films of shots of New York City streets, and it was almost, you could like look at the years, like 1901 to 1905 or so, and there's a couple cars in with the wagons, and then all of a sudden it's just cars and cars and cars. And so that was, a lot of it was sort of informed by research, but the craft of it was honestly just hammering at it until I figured out how to get through, because there's also like a few lines after that's about the subway and how the subway started, and it was only from like City Hall up to I think like 120 something or 140 something, and it was just the one. It was almost like their showcase. It was like their proof of concept that we're going to dig in the ground from here to here, and that's going to be a subway, and there's going to be stations, and then after that, just the whole thing just sort of exploded and sort of grew all over the island. But it really was just it was a process of the research and just writing it over and over till I got it right.
And it's also, I got to say, a real gift to us, because in 8 years, you go from not a lot of cars to cars and telephones. And, we're very conscious of how the world has changed and communication has changed in our lifetimes, but it's happened before, it happened at the beginning of the last century too. And you really bring that vividly to life. Speaking of bringing things to life, I love the new characters. I just love them. I'm trying really hard not to do any spoilers, but over the course of the year, Anna, the poor girl who's been seduced and betrayed, has a son, and he becomes a character by the time he's 14, 15 years old, which I wasn't expecting. Mm-hmm. There's also a wonderful and just oddball girl who is the kind of heroine you almost never see. She's not nice.
No.
And she's the daughter of a pretty difficult old man, a rabbi, and her name is Kindle. And then there's a boy golem and a girl, Jinni.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to say anything, but
Yep.
there are.
Yep.
And so what I want to know from you, my love, is how did you have them in mind, any of these characters in mind, while you were working on the first book or toward the end of it? Like, when and how did they come to you?
When I started thinking about, okay, am I going to write a second book? After the first one came out and it became clear that, okay, it was doing okay. And I was, people are asking me, are you going to keep going? Are you going to write a sequel? I was like, okay, so what would I do for a sequel? And what struck me was that I wanted to show what the process of assimilation was going to be like for them. And I'd sort of set that challenge at the end of the first book, not just that here they are, they're going to really try to do this. They're going to try to live as humans in New York. They're going to try to fit in enough to pass, and they're going to possibly try to have a relationship with each other. And so then the challenge then is, okay, what does that look like day to day? What does that look like on paper? And it struck me that as an immigrant tale, which this is, the question, one of the central struggles in any immigrant tale is that of assimilation, and where you feel like how far is too far, and have I forgotten where I came from, and the embarrassment sometimes when you look at someone who's fresh off the boat and they don't even know, like, they're looking around like, how do I do this? Where am I going? And it's like, oh my God, you just got here. Oh, okay, let me show you how this works. But at the same time, then from the greenhorn's point of view, like looking at someone who's a fellow countryman, or had been, at one point and still is to some degree, and saying, oh wow, you really did just like forget us all, didn't you? And that struggle, and how much is, that line is different for every person. And that was the impetus that had gotten me writing about these characters in the first place, was looking at the immigration through the lens of these mythological creatures. And so what I decided was that I would take like two of the more traditional, the more classic forms of these characters, because Chava and Ahmad, I wrote them so that they could be, so they could pass. But these two new characters, Yasela the Golem, he is a golem in the traditional mold of huge and hulking and silent. And yes, and was a little, not the most intellectually, advanced. And then Dima, the Jinni, who goes by Dima, she is free. That's one thing that differentiates her from Ahmad, because he is still bound to human form, and he has like lost a bunch of his powers. But she is free, and she can turn into anything she wants, and she's invisible, and she can fly, and she is much more of where we see Ahmad in the flashbacks in the first book, of being slightly amoral. Not really understanding what the deal is with the humans, and just living on a different scale than everyone else. And that ability to sort of pull back and look at humans from above or from a distance and go, wow, you really are insignificant, aren't you? And you guys only live to be like 80 years or so. Oh my God, it's like you're barely here at all. And, so she is sort of a chaotic force to that effect. And so I wanted them, I wanted there to be some interplay with the relationships. And that was why they're, in a very heteronormative sense, they are sort of the opposite genders and so on. But at the same time, I really wanted them to sort of turn around and face where they had come from and be like, okay, what does this mean as far as I'm concerned?
Well, I was very happy to see Sophia Winston in this book again, and I felt like there was some chemistry between her and the Jinni. I don't know, were you aware of that? I was.
Yeah, kind of a little. I wanted there to be. But I wanted it to be the possibility and not overly stated, because that would have.
Yeah, no, but I feel like you keep telling us, oh, the Jinni are so wild and free and immoral and follow the rules, and it was really great to see this Jinni thinking that way. I thought you did a really great job with her. So why is the whole immigrant thing so important to you? Why was that something you really wanted to talk about? What's your personal background on that?
So I'm let's see, my grandparents on both sides were all Holocaust survivors. My dad's family came. My dad's parents met in a displaced persons camp in Austria, and that's where he was born. And then he came over when he was 3 with them. My mom's parents, so they're the Polish Jews. My mom's parents were the German Jews, and they came over earlier 30s, sort of. So they came over like before the worst of it, and my dad's parents survived the worst of it and came over. And I grew up with that. There's that. I hear people talking about intergenerational trauma and the sort of handed down. I always knew that this had happened, and that was always part of my life, and just the idea of growing up, slightly different than everyone else. I was the only person I knew whose grandparents all had accents. I thought everyone's grandparents had accents until I was like, in probably like 5th grade or something. I started to realize, oh, wait a minute, I just met her grandma and she lives down the street. How is that possible? And she talks like an American. She talks like she's from Illinois, like the rest of us. But anyway, and then my husband, his father grew up Sunni Muslim in Syria, in a town called Hama city. It's like the 3rd biggest city in Syria. His mom grew up Polish Catholic in Chicago. They met in France. He was born in France, and along with his older sister, and they all came over. And so he also had that sense of like being someone not from somewhere else, or whose family was from somewhere else. He got a lot of bullying during the first Iraq War in school. And so when we met in college, it was, I'm Jewish, he's Arab American. We grew up 45 minutes away from each other in suburban Chicago. It's not like we had lived completely different lives. What connected us, one of the things that connected us, was this sense of being the children of immigrants and feeling like that was we were all slightly off, slightly different. And so that was something that I had wanted to explore in these books. And it's in this book, the first one, and then to keep going in the second one and just sort of look at the different ramifications.
Do you feel like you could go deeper in the second book?
I felt like I could. The time span allowed me to explore in a way that the first one didn't. The first one I felt like was more plot driven. The second one was a little more. It gave the characters enough rein, especially in the first half of the book, to really differentiate themselves from each other, from the humans around them, while at the same time trying to fit in. And at that point, like I have to figure out how to write books where the plot is layered evenly through the book. Both of my books, like the plot just sort of speeds up, and the last like 3 chapters take place over the course of an hour and a half or so. And so that's my challenge going forward, is a regulated plot.
I don't think people mind too much, but okay, I know what you're talking about.
It for me, for no one else, and I'm like, oh my God, how much, do I have left to go? But I felt like I could go deeper in this because it was more about the characters having established themselves and then just living their lives to a certain extent, where the first one, it was that process of discovery the whole time, where both of them land in New York and they have no idea what's going on, and they're like, what is this, what is that, how do I do this? And so we're discovering along with them, which is part of the fun, just to have that perspective. But the second one was a little more domestic, I feel like, in that way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I gotcha. I've read some great interviews with you that focus on various different things in the book. And the thing I really thought about today when I was getting ready to talk to you was language. I like the different ways that you use language. And you could read the entire book as a kind of a meditation on stories and storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of give that away at the beginning with what seems like merely a useful ploy of a prologue that's just 2 pages long that tells the same story as the humans tell it and then as the Jinni tell it, and then saying, well, you're going to hear another version about this human and this jinn. But then when I was looking through the whole book, I realized there's a lot about who tells what to whom and how simply following a story is people's motive for doing things. Particularly, I was really struck the Jinni, the female Jinni, becomes obsessed, and she's not a person who's real eager to leave home, but she becomes obsessed with this story of the, hold on, you have such a great name for him. Wait, do you remember the
iron-bound Jinni?
The iron-bound Jinni. So it's pretty great that Ahmad doesn't even know that he's a mythic character back home, but he is. And she hears the myth, and she decides it is her fate to find him, and ultimately ends up in New York, flying around going, why do you all live in boxes? She's a great character. And I also thought her physicality was terrific. You really, you're told, oh, they go on the wind and they become flame, but I could really see it the way you wrote it, and I really appreciated that. But so she's kind of driven by a story, and Sophia is wandering all over the Middle East looking for a cure for the problem that she's been left with, the physical ailment. And she's following a story here and she's following a story there. Talk to me a little about stories and storytelling.
Yeah, I feel like about halfway through the writing process is when it came to me that in the end, this was all about stories. And I literally wrote that down in a piece of paper that I still have somewhere, just in big capital letters. It's all about stories. And how, because one of the things, what you started off with was talking about the language, and I'd had it in my head when I began writing this book that Chava and Ahmad would talk to each other in a mix of languages, that this was their private language that they spoke in. And that was like this like melange of human languages, because they understand all languages, all human languages, and so they would like pick sayings or words here and there and mix them up, and that would be the way that they communicated with each other, and that other people overhearing it would think it totally bizarre. I have to, and the way where I got that from was my nephew, who grew up trilingual. He knows, he grew up speaking English, Arabic, and French. And when he was little, when he would get angry, he would mix up his languages. And he would say, his parents figured out eventually that what he was doing was using whatever language he could to get to where the end of the sentence was fastest. Like the simplest grammar, the shortest words, because he was angry. And he was going to say what he was going to say in really quickly. And so he would literally change between English, French, and Arabic in the middle of his sentences just to get the words out. And so that like became about the language. And then when I started thinking about the languages and the idioms that they would choose, I was like, okay, well, that's about stories, really. And then, that became, and then when I was working in the character of Dima of the Jinniya, I started to think about, okay, so how would she know about Ahmad? I didn't want her to just bump into Ahmad. I didn't want her to just sort of wander over to the US and bump into him on the street, because that's just like the author just like picking up a chess piece and moving it and putting it down, and it deprives her character of agency. And I was like, okay, so what story, what would she have heard? Would it have been the story of how he came back to the desert and planted the flask, buried the flask in the desert, and then left again, which is what we see at the end of the first book. And then I was like, oh, okay, so she hears the story. And then I started like writing out the story of the Ironbound Jinni. And then at some point, and at that point, okay, she has to be a character who will follow a story. Well, what does that mean about her? And how can I tie that into something else? And it all just sort of grew until at one point I realized, oh no, this whole thing is about language and stories. And it's probably chicken and egg, because at some point, like you hit a critical mass of theme in your book, and then everything just sort of orients itself around that. And, at some point, like whatever draft I was working on, I was like, and I went back to the beginning and I wrote that prologue. And then it became about hearing stories from different points of view, and who was the villain and who was the the hero, and how that might, change, and how a person might believe in a certain story about themselves until they hit a point where they couldn't believe it anymore and have to face reality. And at some point, that is what Ahmad does as well. And so honestly, it all just sort of came out of the process itself.
I hope everybody's thinking of good questions and putting them in the YouTube chat. I've got a few more minutes to ask mine. And so let's stick to language and idioms. Both Chava and Ahmad at several points become very worried because they're picking up American idioms. And even though they've been speaking human languages for a long time, they're really freaked out when they start picking up idioms like, oh, he'll be the death of me, or I can't remember what the other ones are. But there's some terrific ones. And why was that a thing for them? They were speaking English anyway. Why was using particular idioms? Was it because they were about people's bodies? Was it because they were classical language? Was it about time passing? What was going on with that?
I think some of it, especially for Ahmad, is about bodies. And like at one point he uses, the one that really freaks him out when he first says it is not off the top of my head. Arbeli, his business partner, asks him if he knows something, like what they got in the back room, and he's like, oh, not off the top of my head. And then he's like, I didn't used to have a head. That's the thing. For him, it's like this, he's non-corporeal in his, usual form. The human form is something that he has been locked into because of sorcery. But for him, it's like I've turned human, that I can think of myself that I think of myself now as just having a head and arms and legs and a body, instead of, a form that's formless, that's like basically fire and wind. And that's why he gets like super freaked out. He also has his own language that he can't even speak anymore because he can't speak in human form. And that is a loss for him, that at first, these things where it's like it takes you a while to really feel a loss if it's something subtle. The first he's like, whatever, and then it just strikes him one day, I'm never going to speak my own language again. And that's something that he doesn't feel like he can share with Chava, even though they have this bond over human language, that it's like their game that they play, that they they borrow idioms from that they overhear as they're walking through the city at night. And his favorite is don't bite my head off. And she likes porca miseria, which is Italian, means basically misery pig. And she's more okay with it than he is, but they both realize that it is part of like the human disguise that they wear. And for him, and she is more Chava is more drawn to humans and has more incentive to pass. And so for her, it's less of a deal that she's, sort of taking these on, even though she knows that it is part of her disguise. For him, it's like, I am becoming human, and that's freaking me out.
When you're doing characters who are speaking, Yiddish instead of English or whatever, or bad English, that you use fairly standard language. But when Anna's little boy Toby becomes a teenager, he's got the best language. I just marked this one thing because I particularly liked it, where and he's become a telegram delivery boy.
Yes, he's a Western Union boy. Bicycle messenger, yeah.
So he's carrying a pail. I love that it's a pail of chop suey. And actually, can you tell us what chop suey is?
Okay, so chop suey is an Americanized, slightly Americanized Chinese dish that became very popular with the working class when Chinese came over. Because oh God, when was that? It was like the turn of the century was when I think chop suey became popular, and it's just like noodles and gravy and soy sauce and sort of bits and pieces of meat and veggies that would just all get sort of stir fried up and slapped in an oyster pail, which is what those
oyster pail.
Yes, and that's what because oysters were like a huge source of protein and eaten a ton around the turn of the century by working class. It was like getting your like chicken nuggets. You go and you go to the oyster cellar and you get a pail, and it was the folded boxes that like are to the traditional takeout containers. Those are called oyster pails. That's like the actual term for them. That's where that originates.
Wow.
And so they would just take the pail and go home. And so for chop suey, there are these chop suey joints, in Chinatown and around Chinatown. And Toby loves chop suey, so that's one of the things he goes and eats all the time.
And it sounds like it was cheap and plentiful, because
Yes.
even when the family doesn't have money, he gets chop suey. So he takes it. He's trying to get into a place. So he says, I went to Pell Street to get this for a lady, but when I came back, she didn't want it anymore. So now I'm stuck with it. And the kid he's talking to says, you ain't gonna eat it? Nah, I still got deliveries to make. It'll be cold by the time I'm done. I can't stand the stuff cold. You want it? It's just such a different language from the language of the previous generation.
Mm-hmm. And Toby is the only character in the book who's allowed to say okay. That him.
Yes.
Oh no, there's but it's his generation that say okay, even though the word itself is older, the word itself is from the 1800s, but it just felt too modern in the first book to use the word okay at all. And so it's only the kids are allowed to say okay in this one. But that sense of like blah blah blah, that you're just sort of like a more lingo way of talking.
So from my days in radio, I have to do the question, and I suppose print people do this too, which is, what haven't we talked about that you would kind of like to say? We're starting to get some questions. If anybody else has a question, we're going to come to an end soon. So type up your questions in the YouTube chat. And I also have a procedural question. I actually know the two people who have done questions so far. Am I allowed to say people's names? I guess I am. Can everybody see the chat, or is it just me?
There's the YouTube chat and then there's the Zoom chat. And I think you and I only see the Zoom chat, and everyone else.
Are there any, if there's YouTube chat questions that we're not seeing, Zach was going to ship them over to us. So maybe there are. Anyway, what haven't I hit? What do you want to talk about?
What haven't?
Do you have any questions for me? I mean, you're going to be doing this a lot, by the way, so.
Any questions for you? Any questions for,
No, maybe we're good.
What do you think I haven't mined yet in Jewish folklore and mythology?
Ooh, I don't know. I mean, the thing is that there's no monolithic Jewish folklore. It's kind of, what part of the world did your people end up wandering off to?
Yeah.
We tend to think of Jewish as the Ashkenazic, the Eastern European, which is a very Eastern European infused thing. The more I hear about the Sephardic, which, which is the people who had to leave Spain in 1492 because they were all about to be killed otherwise, they went out all over the Mediterranean, and some of them went up into Bulgaria and stuff. They had their own language called Ladino. You already know this, but I'm telling you.
Ladino, yep.
Ladino, which was a mix of, and scholars still recognize, 15th century Spanish and Hebrew, just as Yiddish is Old German and Hebrew and
Russian
else.
and
so anyway, so there, and then American Boychik, which is what Anna calls Toby. So their culture is much more Arabic, and a lot of them settled in Yemen and wherever. So there's that whole skein of things. I, as a fantasy writer and reader, have always been frustrated by the fact that vein of romantic fantasy that the British writers, not even the European, because the French have crap fantasy until you get to the 17th century and the fairy tales. But the Tolkien and the C.S. Lewis, who were such a foundation of the fantasy that we then all grew up reading, they've got this rich, magical, desirable folk and fairy lore that just isn't there in the Jewish. It's what there is kind of off-putting, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't even bother is my feeling. There are people doing it now really well. But so what do you think?
It's interesting what you say about the, there is such a focus on the Ashkenazi, and that's what I grew up with. And that was, I think it's only recently that Jews of my generation who grew up in the Ashkenazic tradition are like starting to realize, oh wait, we've been keeping people out. We've been gatekeeping without even realizing it sometimes. And so like I was at a reading in San Diego, and a woman came up to me afterwards and was talking. She was Iranian Jewish, and she said that her, and her family had been here for a while, and she was relatively old. But she talked about like that her family, they would have dances, and like someone would be dancing and like spin around in a trance and like get into like a trance state, and they would say, the jinn are in her now. And it was like Jewish traditions that have jinn, and it's like, oh, of course, it makes perfect sense. Because that was, the folklore of the region. Of course, there would be a Jewish version of that, and that just sort of like, set me thinking. And so I would love. Oh God, I actually at one point started writing some of that. There's a character in the book who you see like for a page and a half, who's he's Sophia's like sort of love interest who ends up flaking out on her at one point.
Yeah.
And I wanted to write a lot more about him and his family, and he's Jewish from Jaffa, and that his family had been there for generations, and that they were the more Arabic, fluent Jews and all of that. And so I don't know. I think I want to include some of that at some point. I want to broaden out beyond the very, my tradition, Ashkenazic. But, I'm also afraid to do that, I think, a little, because, what if I get it wrong? But we'll see.
Well, that's why we have sensitivity readers.
Exactly. I know already I got stuff wrong in this book, and everyone will email me, and thank you for your emails in advance.
Tara O'Shea wanted to know, and I can't tell if her tongue's in her cheek or not. Do you have anybody that you're running the Jinni half of the story past? To make sure it felt authentic. But does she mean that, or does she mean something else? I mean, not a lot of us have Jinni friends.
Do I have anyone like Ali Alami in my life to run the Jinni half of the story past? Not in a sort of yes and no. I at some point had to decide that my version could be different. That because when I started again the whole issue of authenticity and like, okay, I want to get it right. And so when I did the first book, I started reading all the various myths and folktales, and it's like, okay, at some point you get to the point where there is no right version, because everything is there are so many versions of, what are their abilities, the jinn's abilities, what are the, what got kind of codified in the more popular stories. And then, especially, God, we could be here all night talking about the 1001 Nights and the westernization and the translations and what that sort of, homogenized and all of that. But when you get to the original stories, Jinn can do everything. You can find a version of Jinn that let them do whatever you want them to do. So at some point it became about me making the rules for myself that were at least based in some extent on some of the traditional tales, but that also allowed me to situate Ahmad as being able to live a human seeming life. And I figured as long as I was respectful, I didn't make them, like sparkly vampires or whatever, but I would, and then stuck to whatever I came to, then that would be okay. And that would be enough.
That's the thing. When you're playing with the fantastic, you must be consistent, but you are the one who gets to choose what the consistency is. When I wrote Thomas the Rhymer, which is based on, British folklore, but it's got an elf land in it, and there was a lot I could pick up, but then there was a point where I just had to make it mine.
Yeah. But but there's also, you asked about sensitivity readers. My father-in-law is my sensitivity reader as far as that concerned, and my husband too, to a certain extent. Just to, the Jewish saying is ask a rabbi what time it is, and he'll tell you how to build a watch. That's sort of, my father-in-law is not an imam or anything, but he is a scholar of history, and he is one of these people who remembers everything he reads. And if you ask him a question, you will be there for an hour with him as he goes back, and he's like, well, first you have to go back to the dawn of time, and he starts from there and works forward, and it's like, oh my god. So I got to write everything down. So yeah, that's I keep it in the family, I guess.
Yeah, well, that's great. Somebody asked if we can recommend other Jewish-inspired science fiction and fantasy, and there is a woman, and I know her. I've even had dinner with her. She's on the tip of my brain. You had a talk with her recently.
Rena Rossner.
Thank you.
It's the Light of the Midnight Stars. Is that Light of the Midnight Stars is the new one that she wrote, and it's really good. And I can't remember what her first book was called, but Rena Rossner, Rossner, and she is a great writer and a sweet person. Also Naomi Novik, who's written a bunch of stuff now, but Spinning Silver is the most Jewishly connected, I guess, of her books. It's a very altered but still recognizable version of the Rumpelstiltskin tale that focuses on the heroine is the daughter of a moneylender, and her father's a very bad moneylender because he is far too kind and everyone cheats him, and so she has to sort of become the steely backbone of the family and go around and collect all the money, and she runs afoul of what is basically the king of Elfland. But it's very, it sort of turns a lot of the anti-Semitism around moneylenders on its head.
In a way, when we're talking about writing Jewish fantasy, there's a part of me that sees that the way forward is not so much through the folklore as through fantasizing our history. Because our history is really powerful. Lisa Goldstein's The Red Magician is a book that I actually edited the first half of when I was a young editor at Simon & Schuster. And it's almost Ursula Le Guin, wizard-like figure turning up during the Holocaust. It's an amazing book that sort of synthesizes that desire we have for those wizards with our actual history. And it's in a way, that's what Naomi Novik's doing as well. And even in my own little kiddie book that is just about to come out and is on the page for this bookstore. And let me also make a plug for the bookstore. Please, please, please. I think Helene you can even get autographed books from Helene if you order through this wonderful bookstore that's hosting us tonight. And you can apparently advance order my retread of a performance piece I used to do called The Golden Dreidel. And in that, I put as much folklore as I could think of in that was vaguely like the Nutcracker, only Jewish. But my favorite character in it is the fool, who is basically Danny Kaye. You know?
Oh my God, he is.
Yeah. He's a combination like Danny Kaye and all the jokes that my dad and my uncle used to tell at the table, which were the jokes of their childhood when they were the children of immigrants in New York. Yes, thank you. Thank you for knowing who Danny Kaye is. And so to me, it's like, we're going to talk. That can be worked in. We don't need necessarily to go to the demons and the golems all the time. There's a lot of material that I think we can use. Hi, is it time?
Hi.
Are we done?
It's time.
Okay.
Anybody have any last comments, or are you guys good?
I'm sorry that we didn't get to so many questions, probably because we were just talking and talking, but
that's great.
Thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you both so much. This was a wonderful discussion. You're both such a joy to listen to, and I'm sure our viewers will be so thrilled to buy your book. I want to hold up. This is the first one. You can get that at Book Passage. I have to say, I know we're not supposed to judge books by their covers, but your covers are beautiful. And this is the new one. And we do have signed copies, as Ellen mentioned. She kind of did my job for me, because I want to just remind everybody that by purchasing books, you're supporting not only Book Passage, but authors and the events that we can continue to do. So please purchase books through Book Passage, especially the books from our authors this evening. And you can call us. We will send them to you. We will hold them for curbside pickup. You can come in the store now, which is exciting. People have been having fun coming in the store again after, some people come in and say, I haven't been in a bookstore in a year and a half. So it's great. You can order online at bookpassage.com. So please do so. And thank you again, both of you, and everybody stay safe and healthy till the next one.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having us.